There is a romance to the garrison era in London. It brings to the imagination images of officers dancing into the night with beautifully dressed belles, the excitement and danger of military steeplechases, and military theatricals where redcoats put on petticoats and play women's roles with full melodramatic fervor. Behind these stereotypes lies a deeper narrative. How officers from abroad brought cultural and economic impetus to a town on the frontier. The British military came prepared to put down rebellions and quash border incursions. They left a legacy, not of war, but of culture, painting the first views of London, organizing balls and steeplechases, and building London's first theatre, the Theatre Royal. In Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, the presence of the officers in Meryton greatly enriched the lives of the Bennet daughters, just as the presence of officers in London enriched the social and cultural life of London, Ontario, and especially the Harris daughters of Eldon House. Even though references to the officers seem to dominate Pride and Prejudice, there are relatively few quotations that refer to the officers directly, where they are stationed, what day-to-day life of the garrison was like. We may fill out our imagination by examining the similar situation of the officers stationed here in London, Ontario. I will talk a little about the garrison experience in London and conclude by speaking a little about how Garrison Theatricals has been bringing a piece of it back to life. In 1837, some citizens were dissatisfied because they wanted more democracy in Upper Canada. A group of them, led by Alexander Mackenzie, planned to march on Toronto. Their rebellion failed, and many rebels were imprisoned or executed. Mackenzie had a price put on his head. Exiled rebels began agitating from the United States. My clicker isn't doing what I want it to do. Come on. Yeah, there we are. Exiled rebels began agitating from the United States. We burned one of their ships. They burned one of our ships. Things were starting to get hot and heavy. This gives you a sense of why it is that the British were worried. After the rebellion of 1837, the British sent garrisons of soldiers to what was then known as Upper Canada, to Brockville, Kingston, Toronto, Hamilton, Amherstburg, St. Thomas, and of course, London. The very first regiment, the 32nd, came down to London from Halifax. Okay, now I took the bus recently from Ottawa, Ontario to London, Ontario, and that's 8.5 hours. So first of all, these guys came from Halifax. And second of all, they came in sleighs. In January. I was trolling around the National Archives website, as you do, and I ran across a whole bunch of pictures of people sleighing from the 1830s, just to give you a sense of what it might have been like to do that. Lots of treacherous crevasses and difficult hills and weariness and breakdowns, till they finally arrived in London, Upper Canada. Mrs. Anne Port recalled the arrival of the military in London in January of 1838. The regulars were sent for at first outbreak, but it took them so long to travel the distance, the 32nd came the whole way down from Halifax on sleighs, that things had pretty well quieted down before they arrived. I remember being so disappointed when I saw them march through the town, and their coats were not red, but a big soldier threw open his grey overcoat, and my small woman's eyes were delighted with the sight of the red coat, which afterwards seemed to take possession of the town. This interest in officers' red coats is a repeated theme in Pride and Prejudice. Here, Mrs. Bennet betrays her own fascination with the scarlet coats, even as she attempts to defend her daughter's interest in them. My dear Mr. Bennet, you must not expect such girls to have the sense of their father and mother. When they get to our age, I dare say they will not think about officers any more than we do. I remember the time when I liked a red coat myself very well, and indeed, still I do at my heart. If a smart young colonel with 5,000 or 6,000 a year should want one of my girls, I should not say nay to him. And I thought Colonel Forrester looked very becoming the other night at Sir William's in his regimentals. London in 1838 had a population of 1,090. London had to accommodate 409 new soldiers in a town of 1,000 people. So how do you think they were going to do this? Mrs. Ann Port said, "We had 5 of them billeted on us. Every resident was obliged to accommodate a certain number till the government secured Dennis O'Brien's new block for a barracks." The local residents would have gotten to know the men pretty well by the time they moved into their new accommodations, which was Dennis O'Brien's block here on the left, next to the courthouse building. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was capacious. And the government commandeered O'Brien to say, "We want your building." And when the British military does that, and you happen to be Dennis O'Brien, what do you say?
Yes, sir.
"To Thomas Rayner, Assistant Commissary General. Sir, I hereby offer to let 2 of my brick houses situate in the courthouse square for the service of the government until the 30th of April next, or for such longer time as the same may be required, at the rate of £200 Halifax currency per annum, and to put the cookhouse and privies into a proper state of repair. The rent to commence from the date when the engineer officer shall report that the same is done. The boilers in the cookhouse to be fixed at the expense of the government. Dennis O'Brien." Jane O'Brien, wife of Dennis O'Brien, describes the time in a letter to Isabella Crichton. "I will attempt to give you a faint sketch of the times upon which we have fallen. London, since December last, has been one of continual scene of confusion, crowded with soldiers, and large numbers of them were billeted on each house for want of barracks, and it has been but recently since we got rid of them. And arrests for persons suspected of being implicated in the outbreak were going on all through the winter. Mr. O'Brien as well. He has escaped censure from all parties and has done a great amount of business with the government, and has got nearly all his money. He has rented his brick building for barracks. We have in town about 300 regulars and expect the number to increase shortly to 1,000. Great dissatisfaction and excitement prevails in the country, and many are daily leaving." And later, in more permanent fashion, they built some log barracks, and they built some frame barracks. And you can see here in a picture from Ainsley what the frame barracks looked like when they were finally built. You can see the frame barracks there on the right and the log barracks on the left.
Where is that?
This would be, if you were standing at the corner right here of Oxford and Richmond, looking that way, that's roughly what you would see. So this is Richmond Street down, heading down here. So we're looking here from the north side. That's essentially, well, that's Victoria Park and north of Victoria Park, because the military reserve was considerably larger than the area currently encompassed by Victoria Park. Once the officers got settled into their permanent quarters, things got a little dreary, because they didn't actually have anyone to fight. Here's a tongue-in-cheek diary entry that was printed in the Times in 1842. "There is plenty of leisure time and no temptation from without, so that after being quartered here for a term of years, one might come forth a profound lawyer, or a deep divine, or be entitled to a diploma and write MD after one's name. While considering which of these pursuits to decide upon, fell asleep, and was awakened by the last bugle for dinner. 6 hours afterwards, so there is another day of my life gone to waste." Well, given that setup, what's a chap to do? The officers, to stave off boredom, spent their time in ways that enriched the cultural life of London. Painting some of the early paintings, organizing sleighing clubs, and steeplechases, and balls, and, of course, courting the local belles. In chapter 15 of Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen says, "Their eyes were immediately wandering up in the street in quest of the officers, and nothing less than a very smart bonnet indeed, or a really new muslin in a shop window could recall them. But the attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man whom they had never seen before, of most gentlemanlike appearance, walking with another officer on the other side of the way. Witness the parallels to Charlotte Harris's account of first meeting Captain Crespini. Charlotte Harris, November 2nd, 1848. Coming home, Mary and I saw two gentlemen across the street whom we thought we knew and bowed to them. They returned in a most condescending way and crossed over, when to our horror we found they were strangers. We went to Mrs. Lynch's shop. They followed us, and when we came out, they went in and asked who we were. They again followed us, and we went into a shop and avoided them. When we returned home, Mr. Peard and Mr. Neve told us that they were Captain Crispini and Mr. Medhurst. Mama asked Captain Crispini and Mr. Howard to dinner tomorrow. I guess I didn't quite put the transitions in that slide, but there you can see this is what Dundas Street looked like in 1842. And in fact, if you were able to see just about here, that's about where the theater would have been. You can see that they're all wood-framed buildings, all of which, or many of which, went up in smoke in 1844 in the Great Fire. In Chapter 7 of Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen notes, "Every day added something to their knowledge of the officers' names and connections. Their lodgings were not long a secret." In London, some of the officers left the barracks and lived in buildings in the town. Two of the officer artists, Dartnell and James Alexander, shared digs in the town, pictured here, and other officers who could afford it got themselves quarters away from the barracks. In Chapter 7, also of Pride and Prejudice, at length, they began to know the officers themselves. Now, the London officers would frequently be invited to Eldon House, furthering the acquaintance between the officers and the daughters of Amelia and John Harris. The diary of Charlotte Harris, November 1st, 1848. Mr. Peard and Mr. Neve dined with us. Mr. Neve and I sat together at dinner and made a great noise. Our end of the table certainly was the merriest. After coffee, I tried to leave them, but Eliza and Jack came for me, and I was obliged to return and play backgammon with Jack, while Eliza tried to take my profile. But she did not succeed. She always fails. Mary and I waltzed and galloped in turn with Mr. Neve around the table. We sent them away at 10. November 21st. Captain Herbert left at 2 o'clock. We were exceedingly sorry to see him go. We had talked incessantly since he came, and have not said half that we wished. Mary gave him a drawing. Eliza and I promised to do one for him too. Some officers proposed for one of the daughters, but were rejected or discouraged. Inevitably, this would lead to some lost and broken hearts. Lieutenant, later Sir Daniel Lysons, an accomplished horseman and artist who took charge of the theater here and painted the scenes, asked for Elizabeth Harris's hand, but was discouraged by her mother, Mrs. Amelia Harris. Others also vied for the attention of the Harris daughters, most notably Edward Stanley, son of Lord Stanley. His father would soon become, in 1852, Prime Minister of England. October 25th, this is also from Charlotte Harris's diary. Mr. Stanley and Jack left for Fort Talbot. Mr. Stanley could scarcely tear himself away. He has fallen desperately in love with Amelia. November 15th. Mr. Neve breakfasted with us and left at 12 for Toronto. Mr. Stanley also left. He could scarcely turn himself away. Amelia wanders about like a lost spirit. He is to return in the spring. Edward Stanley is never mentioned in the diaries again. I think you'll agree that the younger Stanley bears a striking resemblance to Colin Firth's depiction of Darcy in the BBC Prejudice. Edward Stanley later married Lady Mary Sackville West. That's Lady Mary Sackville West. Though there is no